reception like that. Like I tell a lot of other people when I go outside of Washington, I don't get an applause like that in Washington, D.C. So it was great to be among friends. And Walter, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and help you get reelected, because that is very important. There was an informal poll on Capitol Hill, and Walter was elected the best of something. He probably forgets about this, but he was elected the friendliest member of Congress. And you know what? I'm going to elect him to another position tonight. He has the biggest heart in Congress, let me tell you. But it is a real delight to be here. You know, I'll say this at risk, because when you mention schools, sometimes you get into trouble. But it's good to be back in North Carolina. My son and I both graduated from Duke Medical School. So. Well, I spent 4 years here. That was between 57 and 61. But it was a short time after I went up to Detroit, Michigan to finish my medical training. I was in my second year of a residency when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out. And I got a little draft notice that said, you will be drafted. But I tell this story a lot to my veterans at home, because a lot of us have been drafted in the military, and some are pure volunteers. And I would tell them, well, you know, I volunteered and I served 5 years in the Air Force during the 1960s. But then I have to confess, I said, I didn't really volunteer. What happened was I got this draft notice. The last thing I was looking for was to break out my medical training. And the draft notice said, you are going to be drafted as a buck private and be in the Army unless you want to volunteer, and you can be a doctor and a captain. So I said, I volunteered immediately. But I did stay in, and it was an experience. It was a sad decade, though, when you think about what happened in Vietnam. That was a decade that I began to think very seriously about the war issue. Of course, it crossed my mind quite frequently, because I do remember World War II and friends and neighbors and family members being sent over, and some not coming back. But during Korea, it was a time when one of my teachers was sent over, and he didn't come back. At the time, I didn't realize the seriousness of all this, but looking back, I think, why did we go to Korea? A UN resolution? That wasn't a very good idea. Why did we go into Vietnam? There was no declaration of war. And since then, I've thought very much about how we go to war, and I am convinced that it's the way we go to war so often is the reason that we have difficulty getting out of war. My firm belief is that the founders were absolutely correct in going to war very, very cautiously, very, very rarely, and not by one individual deciding, but the people decide through their members of Congress, and only Congress can declare the war. And when you have to do it, and you get it over with it and win it. We haven't done a very good job since World War II. We've been in a lot of almost in constant wars and not very many victories. Like, we don't even know who the enemy is and when the war's over. 10 years is way too long to be in Afghanistan as far as I'm concerned. It's time to come home. But I don't talk only about coming home from the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I think it's time to come home from Korea. How long do we have to be in Korea? You know, South Korea is able to take care of itself. And Japan, we've been there since World War II. We subsidize their defense. We subsidize Germany by pouring in millions and millions of dollars and billions over the years. We're broke. We don't need to be subsidizing anybody else. So I say these foreign expenditures are draining us. These wars in the last 10 years have added $4 trillion to our debt. It's really time to change our foreign policy. Yeah. Woo! You know, it's said that we have have to be in the Middle East because we've been attacked. Those supposedly attackers did not come from Iraq, and yet we went into Iraq and did nation building. And I supported, like Walter and just about everybody in the Congress, supported going after those who were precisely responsible for 9/11. But that didn't indicate to go into nation building and have constant war, have 900 bases, or you have 900 bases in 130 countries. That is not what was intended, and it continues to expand. But people can get pretty annoyed with our drone missiles dropping on many people around the world. And a lot of innocent people get killed. People don't like that around the world, and we are not attacked because we're free and prosperous. I am absolutely convinced of that it is because of our presence over there, and a lot of innocent people died. During the time of the decade before we actually marched into Iraq, it was admitted by the administration at the time that 500,000 Iraqi children may well have died from our policies. And Madeleine Albright said, well, that's the price you have to pay. Well, that attitude, I think, has to change. I just do not think that we get along better or have a stronger national defense. I think we're more vulnerable than ever because of that. But I don't think it's all that complicated. I see a lot of problems, the economic problems, the monetary problems, the debt problem, the foreign policy problem. But I believe we got into this mess for the most precise reason why we have not had enough people in Washington that took their oath of office seriously and followed the Constitution. The reason we got into this trouble, maybe we could just get out of that trouble by having people only follow the Constitution. But you know what? Those are radical ideas. But even in a report today, they say, well, you believe in this, A, B, C, and D. What makes you think that you should be a Republican? I said, yeah, I take my oath of office seriously. I think we should have a balanced budget. I think we should only spend money on those things authorized in the Constitution. I think we should have a policy advised by the founders, a policy of friendship and trade and peace, and only go to war with declaration. I said, what makes that not being a Republican? I think that's what Republicans should be advocating, right? One of my favorite senators had been Robert Taft, and he had many of these ideas. He has a statue in Washington, D.C., and he was known as Mr. Republican. So these ideas are not strange, to the Republican Party. But it is indeed a bit of a challenge to get people to understand why just spending more money in the military-industrial complex is going to be beneficial. In my mind, I have a distinct line drawn between military spending and defense spending. I don't want to cut a nickel out of defense. I want to cut a lot out of militarism that doesn't give us the defense. Some people claim that, and Walter was challenged early on when he came out against the wars, some people challenge us and say, well, if you don't support the war, you don't support the troops. Oh, you're un-American. You're unpatriotic. One thing that makes me feel good, and it just passes me by now, I don't think about that anymore, is because in the last campaign, in the current campaign, our campaign raises twice as much money as all the other Republican candidates together from the active military people. Talk to a few, and Walter has told me many times, talking to the military personnel that he knows, how tired out they are, how worn out they are. And you talk to the reservists and the guard units and active duty people, how many trips have they made over there? And it's very destructive. And without knowing what the end result is and what our real goal is, the results aren't very good. I mean, in this last 10 years, we've lost about 8,500 Americans. We've had over 40,000 severe injuries. We literally have hundreds of thousands looking for help. I had a young man the other day came out to endorse me up in New Hampshire, and he was, with great sadness was telling me how many of his friends he lost because he was over there several times in battle. He lost his close friends and saw them die. And he says, now I'm out. And he was still disturbed because he was seeing his friends commit suicide. So it isn't something that that we can blot out of our minds. It's very, very much real, and the consequences will continue. That is why we have to stop the bloodletting. We want to defend our country, but we don't want to do something that just keeps digging a bigger hole for ourselves. But the big issue today, unfortunately, the media asks me not too often about the foreign policy and bringing the troops home. It does come up, but not as much as the economy, and rightfully so. The economy is a big issue. Loss of jobs and the inflation that we have, and no end in sight. And I think most people are very unhappy, even more so than the government thinks we should be, because the government flat out tells us plenty of fibs, and some people call them lies, about how well we're doing. They say, oh, why sweat inflation? There's no inflation. Prices are going up only 2%. But if you go to a private free market economist, he explains to you, oh, prices are really going up 9%, and for some people, maybe lower income, and on the items they have to buy, it might be going up even more so. Oh, they say, yeah, the unemployment rate is bad, but it's 9%. It's been worse, in 1980. But when you look at it, if you count it the old-fashioned way, if you count the underemployed and the people who have given up in the way they counted in the Depression, guess what? We have a 22% unemployment rate. This is why people are unhappy. This is why they're taking to the streets right now, wondering what's going to come of all this. So the conditions are good, and they haven't improved. From my understanding of how the economy works, I believe something drastically happened in the year 2000 with the breakdown of the NASDAQ bubble. Since that time, there have been 30 million new people in this country. The population growth has gone up, but essentially no new jobs. So there's something basically wrong. But our debt has gone up. A lot of people's standard of living has been maintained to some degree, not so much in the last 4 years. It's all based on debt. And individuals can't live on debt forever, even though their standard of living can go up for a while by getting new credit cards. But ultimately, you have to change your habits and get the debt down. But countries and nations aren't expected to do that, especially since they've been introduced to the Keynesian school of economics. They say, no, the real problem is people should spend more, not less. I would advise people who are in debt to live within your means, cut back and pay off your debt, and then save some money and invest and, build up your own personal economics condition. But the liberal economists, the Keynesians, say, well, just spend more money and this will take care of it. Well, the truth is it's very difficult to get people to understand that what is needed in this country is liquidation of debt. We have a financial bubble because of the Federal Reserve System that we have. There's no way we can solve our problem of the recession depression unless we understand why we have a bubble. We have a bubble that bursts and then it collapses, and then you have a recession depression. So you say, well, what do we do with a recession depression? Well, you can't do it unless you know what the cause is, and nobody wants to talk about it. And the cause comes, the number one cause from the financial crisis that we have in the business cycle comes from an organization that was not established originally under the Constitution, is not in the Constitution, came in 1913, and they are the ones who are responsible for so much suffering. And that is the Federal Reserve System that we need to abolish. Carolina, wonderful. Prior to the time the Fed will be ended, because even I, in my book, End the Fed, I don't call for ending the Fed in one day. I'd like to take 2 or 3. But what we need is, exposure of the Fed. Can you imagine an organization like the Federal Reserve that has the authority to counterfeit money at will, to spend it in secret, bail out their friends and cronies on Wall Street and all their banks and corporations, and a third of these trillions and trillions of dollars, up to $15 trillion, went to help people overseas? Don't you think we in Congress have a responsibility to audit the Fed at least, to find out what they're doing? Is very important for a lot of reasons, and I mentioned the business cycle and the conditions. For too long, they've gotten the credit for the good times, and then the bad times would come, and then they would print more money, and it would seem to relieve the conditions. And they got credit for getting us out of the bad times. And I see it the other way around. They create the bubble, setting the stage for the bad times. But the good news is that in the last 3 or 4 years, the Fed has gotten exposed for what they're up to. This is the first time in the whole history of the Fed that people are looking at the Fed. And to me, it's very exciting to go to the campuses around the country who are now understanding Austrian free market economics and the constitutional mandate that you use gold and silver, and also looking into the Fed. So there's a lot of encouragement there. 5 years ago, there was not hardly any interest, and today it's growing by leaps and bounds. So I'm very encouraged by that. But other than the economic crisis that the Fed creates, the creation of money is equivalent to counterfeiting. If you did it, or I did it, we would consider it to be counterfeiters. And matter of fact, even those individuals who claim that all they want to do is follow the Constitution and use gold and silver coins for money, they have been arrested, their gold and silver stolen from the government, and charged them with counterfeiting and also possible terrorism because they want to use gold and silver as currency. I would say the real counterfeiters are up in the Federal Reserve, and we ought to deal with them. One little book that had a lot of influence on my understanding of the law was written by Frederick Bastiat, a Frenchman in the 1850s. And he wrote a book, it was called The Law. And the point he makes in here is that, in the book, is that if you or I can't do something because it's against the law, why would we allow the government to do it? They should have to stand up on the same standard. So if we can't counterfeit money, they shouldn't counterfeit money. But this, in understanding how that works, we put up with the TSA now for nearly 10 years. It's not getting any better, and I don't think they make us any safer. And about 2 years ago, they made the checkpoints at the airports much more onerous. That's when the poking and the prodding and the X-rays got pretty annoying. And so I introduced a bill that said that any TSA agent can't do anything at these points that you or I can't do to a stranger. This is all done in the name of making us safe and secure, but it's a violation. It's a violation of our privacy. It's a violation of the due process of law. It's a violation that they do this without a search warrant. But our lives are not private anymore. There's essentially no privacy left. It's been announced just this last week that there's a change in policy on how to collect student loans. There's a small amount out there. We encourage people to go to college and encourage them to take these loans. There's $1 trillion worth of debt. So we've messed up the economy so badly that if they wanted to go out and get a good job and paying off their debt, they're having a tough time doing it. So the government, encouraged that type of borrowing, but now they can't function in Washington because they don't have enough money, so they have to get more money from the students, and they're going to, crack down on them. So what do? They go out and now they have demanded access to the cell phone numbers of all young people because they know they don't have landlines, and they're going to start calling them on their cell phone and bugging them about when they're going to pay their debt. So one problem leads to another. Let me predict. I mean, the people who are responsible are going to try to pay that debt down. The people that aren't, phone calling on their cell phone by the federal government probably won't raise a whole lot of revenue. Probably the only thing it'll do is hire a few more bureaucrats to get on the phone and start calling people. But this is what our problem is. Too often we look to the federal government too often for our solutions. In a free society, we look to ourselves. We protect liberty. We protect liberty, believing our liberties come from our Creator. Our life comes from our Creator. Therefore, if that is true, and I sincerely believe it, if truly if our life and our liberties are our own, it's in the Declaration of Independence, wouldn't it be logical to say that the fruits of our labor should be our own as well? To go through the process of repealing for the second time an amendment to the Constitution. We got to get rid of the 16th Amendment. Now we take care of that. Well, that makes a lot of people nervous because government has a lot of bills to pay. What would happen to the country if you didn't have an income tax? What would happen? I said, well, we would just, simple little thing, just only do the things that are authorized in the Constitution. We, save a lot of money that way. But, when I talk about this correction, and I can't go into great detail, but I mentioned the fact that you got to get rid of debt, you got to get rid of malinvestment and clear the market, get the prices down on issues, even houses low enough where people will start buying again. But most people, when they're into coming up with a solution to our problem, they say, well, they want to try to impress you about that and being honest with you. They say, but you have to sacrifice. You have to sacrifice in order to get us out of this mess. But in many ways, if you're self-reliant and you're willing to take care of yourself and able to take care of yourself, why would it be a sacrifice if I were able to get the government off your back, deregulate the economy, give you sound money, get rid of the income tax, and quit paying for all these wars? I would think this would be not a sacrifice, but a blessing if I get the liberty. Liberty about 100 years ago sort of split into parts, and this to me has been a problem. There's economic liberty and personal liberty. Economic liberties, most conservatives are pretty good at this. They say the freer the market, the better. They might condone a lot more intervention than I would like, but they understand that free markets are beneficial. But too often they're willing to say, well, maybe we need regulation on people's personal life. We know they know how to spend their own money, and we don't want to tell them, but we need to tell them and instruct them on how they want to run their personal life. But I can't see that. I think it's your right to your life and your liberty, and you have the ability to keep the fruits of your labor. You ought to assume the responsibility of all your action, and you can't go to your neighbor and your friends if you don't act responsibly. That it's your life and your liberty that you have to take care of. We do this pretty well when it comes to our religious values and our intellectual values. We allow people to read some of the worst types of institutions and philosophy. How many hundreds of millions of people were killed by authoritarianism, Nazism, fascism, and communism in the 20th century? Hundreds of millions of people. But we don't ban those books, even though the ideas are very dangerous. We allow people to make personal choices on a very important matter, and that is our spiritual life and our hereafter. So we allow that, but sometimes I think we just overdo it in telling people how to run their own lives. And one thing that this probably doesn't affect anybody here. I'll see if it does. But there's one issue that I use because it's a freedom issue, and I don't happen to desire this freedom. But I want people to have the choice, and that has to do with, don't you think the federal government should have nothing to say about whether or not you would like to drink raw milk or not? but there's another little item, and this might be a little more controversial for you, but you know, in this country you're not allowed to raise hemp. Hemp looks like marijuana, but hemp, if you want to get high on hemp, you'd have to smoke a cigar as big as a phone pole. But we make it illegal because it's harder to enforce some of these other laws. So in doing this, what we have done is we've kicked out a whole industry. I mean, there's so many industrial products you can make from hemp. You can make ethanol from hemp. Guess what? You get more ethanol from hemp than you do from corn. But the corn people don't want hemp legalized. Matter of fact, the cotton people don't want hemp legalized because it would compete with cotton. And besides, hemp is grown with very little, chemicals and very little fertilizer. It's an amazing product. But we have been sort of obsessed with it. During World War II, they begged and pleaded for people in this